For 9 years, long before the dawn, the colossal dairy had been surreptitiously discharging its rejected milk down the incline and into the trench beside Lorna Keller's property line. This substance, labeled as spoiled milk, tainted the air, devastated her lawn, and attracted such a dense swarm of flies that her own son found himself unable to visit. Lorna, a 68-year-old widow, was the final cheesemaker from a creamery that had permanently ceased operations. She had appealed to the county authorities and had also contacted the dairy directly, but her pleas went unheard and no action was taken. Then, on a frigid January morning, when the milk in that ditch had solidified rather than decomposing, Lorna knelt amongst the weeds, cupped a portion in her bare palm, and raised it to her face. The revelation conveyed by that aroma was the sole aspect that 9 years of mistreatment had failed to obliterate. However, that pivotal morning arrived later. To comprehend it fully, one must first grasp the nature of the ditch and all the preceding events, along with the profound patience that an elderly woman who has endured significant loss can cultivate within herself. The ditch stretched along the entirety of the northern fence, approximately 200 feet in length. It was a shallow channel, excavated by some long-departed farmer to divert surface runoff away from the road. For the majority of those years, Lorna considered it the most unfortunate feature of her existence. The situation began the spring following the acquisition of the last of the smaller farms above her by the expansive dairy operation. A tanker truck would arrive on the access road just prior to sunrise, maneuver its rear end towards her fence, and then open a discharge valve. The contents, milk that had curdled during transit, failed to meet quality standards, or simply proved too bothersome for anyone in the region to bother selling, would then be released. In winter, it struck the frozen earth, and in August, it landed on baked clay, where it remained and decomposed. The stench permeated everything, seeping into her curtains, dish towels, and the fabric of her sole respectable coat. During July, it brought flies in a dark, suffocating haze that pressed against the screen door, seeking entry. The grass lining the fence withered to barren soil, which then developed a pale, cracked crust. Lorna's primary concern was her well. Situated 60 feet from the ditch, she spent many sleepless nights calculating the potential depth to which the contaminated water might descend before reaching her wellspring. It found the source during the third summer. One July evening, she drew a glass of water from the kitchen faucet, and a faint yet undeniable sourness accompanied the metallic taste. She promptly poured it down the drain, never again drinking from that tap. Subsequently, she was compelled to transport her drinking water from the spring house, which drew from a clean source higher up the hill, above the polluted ground. This involved carrying 2 heavy jugs up the incline on a garden cart. On the more arduous days, she felt the full weight of her years with every pull of that cart. A woman from the church once offered with kindness to have the county test her well. Lorna expressed her gratitude but declined, already aware of what the results would reveal. It would merely quantify a contamination she could already perceive. Throughout those trying years, she possessed a dog, an aged blue heeler named Bram. Her husband had raised him from a puppy, teaching him to guard the gate and to refrain from bothering the chickens. When her husband passed away, Bram seamlessly transferred his allegiance to Lorna without any prompting. His muzzle was now flecked with gray, and he moved with a certain slowness when rising. But he continued to patrol the fence line with her each morning, and he harbored a greater animosity towards the ditch than she did. He refused to drink from the lower end of the yard. He would stand at the edge of the blighted grass, his hackles raised, growling at the offensive odor as if it were a living entity that had trespassed onto her property. "I understand," Lorna would reassure him. "I truly do. Let's move away from there." She contemplated relocating exactly once each year, typically in February, when the biting cold infiltrated the old house, and a profound loneliness followed in its wake. It was then that she would look at her dog. Hank had discovered Bram as a pup in a box at the feed store, and carried him home nestled within his coat. He had named and trained him, and in his final moments, the dog's chin rested on the edge of the bed. Somewhere within Lorna's consciousness, the man and the dog had become synonymous with unwavering loyalty. To sell the property would mean relinquishing the last tangible connection to her husband's touch. Thus, each February, she would brew herself a pot of coffee and remain. Her son's calls typically occurred on Sundays. Glenn resided 2 hours to the south in the city, selling insurance. He had a wife and a daughter whom Lorna saw only twice annually. He was not a malevolent individual. Rather, he was weary, and weariness in a man can easily be mistaken for indifference when viewed from the receiving end. "Mom," he would begin, a repetition of countless prior conversations, "you cannot continue living adjacent to that. It's detrimental to your health. It's not safe." "This is my home, Glenn. It's a dwelling with a sewage outflow near the kitchen window. They're prepared to purchase your property. They've made an offer. You should accept it and relocate here with us. There's a very pleasant facility nearby, all on one level. They handle your meals. I prepare my own meals. You comprehend my meaning." She did indeed understand his implication. He referred to a place with broad corridors, handrails, and an activity schedule affixed near the elevator, where individuals were taken to be cared for. She had toured such a facility once, solely to appease him, and throughout the visit, a woman down the hall was repeatedly calling a name that remained unanswered. "I'm not prepared for that," Lorna stated. "You are 68 years old. You are isolated up there. I have Bram." Glenn exhaled deeply, a sound that suggested he was rubbing his eyes. "A canine is not a strategic plan, Mother." He had discontinued bringing their daughter to visit the summer she turned 7. They had driven up one Sunday and the flies were particularly bothersome. The child refused to eat on the porch, and at the conclusion of their visit, Glenn stood by his car, his hand on the door, and declared, "Listen, Mom, she wouldn't tolerate it here. I cannot bring her to this environment. Do you comprehend? Not until this situation is resolved." Lorna had indeed understood. She had stood in the yard, watched the car depart down the lane, and remarkably, she harbored no resentment, which was somehow more profound than if she had. Consequently, she let the matter go. Over the prolonged ordeal, she had discerned which battles were worth expending her energy on. The county was not one of them. She had contacted the county on 4 separate occasions in the initial years. A man had visited once, carrying a clipboard. He stood by the fence, holding his hand over his nose, and informed her that the discharge was under review. However, nothing was ever thoroughly investigated. The large dairy was the most significant employer in the township, and, by a considerable margin, the largest taxpayer. A struggling county is unlikely to jeopardize the source of its financial support, regardless of its malodorous output. Therefore, she ceased her inquiries. She kept her windows on the north side tightly shut. Her tomato plants were relocated to the south-facing yard. She learned to live a constrained and quiet existence, a skill she possessed proficiently due to years of practice. Here is a crucial detail that the residents of the upper region remained unaware of regarding the elderly woman whose fence they had despoiled. Lorna Keller had dedicated 31 years of her life as the head cheesemaker at the Valley Co-op, the creamery situated by the river. This establishment procured milk from 40 small family farms and transformed it into cheddar with a delicate, washed rind, which was then distributed to fairs across 3 different states. For most of her career, she had managed the production room, drawing curd with her bare forearms, amidst steam so dense it felt drinkable, assessing a batch by the subtle squeak it produced against her teeth, aging 1,000 wheels on wooden shelves, and meticulously turning each one by hand. She understood milk with an intuition akin to how some people comprehend weather, sensing its subtle transformations before any visual cues emerged. The major dairy operation had consistently undercut their prices on every contract, ultimately rendering the 40 small farms unable to meet their loan obligations. One by one, they were compelled to sell their herds, and the creamery, deprived of its milk supply, eventually closed its doors. On her final day of employment, Lorna carried a single wheel of the washed rind cheese to her truck, the very last one the establishment would ever produce. Throughout the ensuing winter, she consumed it slice by slice, alone at her kitchen table. Once it was depleted, she made no further attempts to produce cheese. There seemed to be no logical reason to do so, as milk was no longer a resource accessible to her. Prior to her tenure at the creamery, before her marriage, and indeed before any of these significant life events, there had been her grandmother. The entire family referred to the elder woman as Oma, which was simply the word for grandmother in the language she had brought with her from the mountains. Oma had been a cheesemaker in the stone spring house, carved into the hillside behind the farmhouse. The spring house still stood, the oldest structure on the property, predating even Lorna herself. It was a low, thick-walled building, with a perpetually cold spring flowing through a trough in the floor and slate shelves along its sides, worn smooth like soap. The water emerged from the earth at a constant 52 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year, irrespective of the season. Oma used to remark that the spring was the family's sole true inheritance. For while money could be spent and land sold, a cold spring would sustain generations if nurtured. Lorna still kept Oma's copper kettle in the spring house, hanging from a peg darkened with age. She also preserved the leather ledger containing Oma's recipes, written in a cramped hand, with portions in English and other parts in the old tongue, which Lorna could no longer fully decipher. She had not ignited the kettle for 4 years. In straightforward terms, Lorna was a woman who had witnessed her entire professional life being acquired, undersold, and ultimately discarded into a ditch. When Glenn advised her to abandon her perceived feud, he failed to grasp that no such conflict existed. A feud necessitates 2 parties. This situation involved one party indiscriminately discharging its refuse and an elderly woman resolutely closing her windows. This was the state of affairs for 9 years, until that fateful January morning. It had been an exceptionally harsh cold spell, with temperatures dropping to 10 degrees below zero at night and remaining only marginally warmer by midday. The cold was so intense that it caused the snow to squeak and the fence wire to hum. Lorna had not slept soundly. She emerged at first light to chip away the ice from the chicken's water dispenser, with Bram stiffly accompanying her, grumbling softly. Their breaths hung in the air like white plumes. The tanker truck had made its passage and departed during the darkness. She could discern its tire tracks and the newly deposited frozen residue along the fence, forming a long, pale line. Bram approached it. This was the peculiar aspect, the detail that Lorna would later ponder repeatedly. The dog, who had eschewed that ditch for the better part of a decade, walked directly to its frozen edge, lowered his snout, and instead of growling, began to dig. Bram, leave it. He paid no heed. He pawed at the hardened surface, whining, and looked back at her, much as he used to when he'd discover a groundhog and beckon her to come and observe. Lorna descended the slope, partly to humor him, and as she drew nearer, she detected a scent. It was not the stench of decay, that was what halted her in her tracks. For years upon year, that ditch had reeked of rot, of milk turned acidic and worse, a pungent, spoiled odor that brought tears to the eyes. However, the extreme cold had wrought a transformation. The frigid temperatures had penetrated that stagnant mass, slowing and separating its components, and the milk Bram was excavating had not spoiled at all. It had soured cleanly. It had coagulated, thickening into a soft, white curd, precisely as milk does when left in a warm bowl, with the appropriate beneficial cultures. The aroma emanating from it transported her directly back to Oma's kitchen on a Saturday morning, 50 years prior. It was bright, lactic, almost sweet. Lorna knelt down. It was not a conscious decision. Her knees were in the snow, and her bare hand was reaching forward before her mind had even registered the action. She scooped a handful of the clabbered milk from beneath the crust, the untainted portion, the part that had been protected, and lifted it to her face, inhaling deeply. It was good. Beneath the filth, the freezing temperatures, and the accumulated indignity of those years, some of the substance they were discarding was, in fact, good milk, even superior to good. She understood the distinction between the thin, grayish liquid produced by cows subjected to excessive exertion and the rich, creamy, grass-fed milk derived from animals that were properly nourished and left undisturbed. And this handful was of the latter variety. Someone on the hill above was discarding milk that Lorna Keller would have traversed the state on her knees to acquire when she managed the production room. She remained crouched there for an extended period, so long that Bram nudged her cheek with his cold nose to check on her. "They have no idea," she said to him very softly. "They are entirely unaware of what they possess." She should have returned inside. Her fingers had become numb, and the wind was picking up. Instead, she proceeded to the spring house, retrieved a clean enamel pail, the smaller one, and walked the lane upwards towards the access road, in the dim, cold light, until she located the precise spot where the valve was situated. There she concealed herself within the brush, like a girl playing a clandestine game. She did not have to wait long. She was intimately familiar with the dairy's routines by then. She knew their schedule more intimately than they did, as for years it had served as an inescapable alarm clock. When the truck returned mid-morning, a smaller vehicle than the one used for the dawn run, she observed the worker disembark and open the valve. The instant the first stream of milk emerged, clean, white, and steamy into the frigid air, before it could contaminate the ground, Lorna emerged. She stepped forward and held her little pail beneath the flow, filling it. 2 gallons of milk, still warm from the pipeline. The worker, upon seeing her, froze. Lorna offered a simple nod, as courteous as one could be, a small gesture exchanged between strangers, and carried her pail back down the hill. That evening, she performed an action she had not undertaken in 4 years. She ignited the burner beneath Oma's copper kettle. She gently warmed the milk, meticulously monitoring the thermometer she kept in the drawer. Once the temperature was optimal, she introduced a small quantity of culture from a packet she had purchased on impulse 2 winters prior and never opened, along with a few drops of rennet. She stirred it 3 times in a slow figure-8 pattern, precisely as Oma had instructed her. Twice, she nearly abandoned the endeavor, telling herself she was a foolish old woman tampering with pilfered milk in the dead of night. Yet, twice, she persevered with the stirring. She then covered the kettle, extinguished the kitchen light, and waited. Upon lifting the lid, the milk had set into a clean white custard, trembling and intact, exuding a small amount of pale green whey at the edges. Lorna divided it into a checkerboard pattern with her long knife, and the curds wept further, firming up. She then carefully scooped them into a cloth-lined mold and pressed it beneath a brick. She carried the entire apparatus across the dark, frozen yard to the springhouse and placed it on Oma's slate shelf, where the cold spring would maintain it at 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Standing in the doorway of that ancient stone structure for a moment, holding her lantern, she felt her grandmother's presence, as if she had only just stepped out. Oma had a saying for every occasion, but one now resurfaced in Lorna's mind, one she hadn't recalled in years. The one Oma would utter, standing right there, when a batch went awry or a churn failed. "Milk doesn't spoil," Oma used to say. "It changes." Spoilage is merely the designation we assign to a transformation we were too indolent to utilize. Lorna had been too weary, too defeated, and too cautious for a considerable time to truly comprehend its meaning. Now she understood. She slept more soundly than she had in an entire season. In the morning, before even preparing her coffee, she went directly to the springhouse. She carefully removed the small cheese from its mold, unwrapped the cloth, cut a thin sliver from a corner, and placed it on her tongue. It was a simple cheese, fresh and young, neither aged nor elaborate. It possessed the taste of grass and cream and the subtle, sweet tang of the culture. It evoked the taste of every Saturday morning of her youth. Without question, it was the finest creation Lorna Keller had crafted with her own 2 hands in a span of time longer than she cared to admit. And there she stood in the cold, the taste lingering on her tongue, and she let out a single laugh, a brief, surprised sound that she hadn't heard from herself in years. Across the yard, faintly on the still morning air, she detected the low diesel hum of the tanker truck descending the access lane in the pre-dawn gloom. Lorna placed the cheese down on the slate. She wiped her hands on her apron. She retrieved the small enamel pail from its hook near the door, and without conscious intent, without any discernible plan she could articulate, she walked out into the gray light and down the frozen slope towards the fence, towards the truck, towards the young woman to whom she had offered a nod the previous day, to undertake an action she had resolutely avoided for 9 long years. The young woman saw her approaching and made no move to flee, though her intention to do so was evident. She had the valve partially open, with a stream of milk already arcing into the frozen ditch. She stood there, clad in a man's canvas coat that dwarfed her hand on the lever, observing the elderly woman descending the slope with a pail. "You are not permitted to be up here," the worker stated, her breathing quickening. "This is dairy property. You must remain on your side." "I have been on my side for a considerable duration," Lorna replied. She stopped a few feet away, set the pail down in the snow, and observed the milk being poured out as waste. "What is your name?" The young woman hesitated. "Marisol." "Marisol, what?" "Reyes." A brief pause. "People call me Sol." "Very well, Sol." Lorna nodded towards the valve. "How much of that do they instruct you to pour out on a morning such as this?" Sol's jaw tightened. "Whatever is on the manifest. Some days it's 100 gallons. Some mornings it's 400. She averted her gaze. "It's not my decision. I drive what they tell me and I dump where they tell me." "I believe you," Lorna said, and she meant it. A subtle easing occurred in the girl's posture, as if a fraction of the burden had been lifted. "I am not here to confront you. I wish to ask you something, and I would appreciate it if you would consider your response carefully. That milk you are currently discarding, is it sour? Has it gone off?" Sol glanced down at the stream, then back up, her expression wary. "Some of it. Not this load. This is just surplus." "Surplus regarding what?" "Surplus of quota. The co-op only pays for a certain amount. Anything beyond that stipulated quantity, the company does not receive payment for, so they do not wish it to occupy tank space or depress the price. Consequently, it is discarded. Perfectly good milk. Yesterday, it was the entire north tank. Flawless. Poured directly onto the ground." Her lips twisted. "The first week I worked here, I wept about it. Now, I just do it." "Where are you from, Sol?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "Down south. I came up 4 years ago for the work. There's always dairy work. No one else wants it." She shrugged, but her eyes flickered towards the road, towards the town, towards whatever lay in that direction. "It's just me and my boy. His father is not involved. This job provides our entire shelter. So please do not ask me to do anything that jeopardizes it." "I am not." Lorna remained silent for a moment. Across the fence, a considerable distance away, she could discern the new free stall barns, their metal surfaces catching the nascent gray light, and the steam rising from 2,000 head of cattle she would never encounter up close. "I would like you to do something for me," she said. "Tomorrow, before you pour, fill these." She nudged the pail with her boot and withdrew a second folded sack from her coat, containing 2 more clean pails. "Fill them with the uncontaminated portion before it reaches the ditch. Place them by the fence post, the leaning one. I will retrieve them after you have departed." Sol was already shaking her head. "No, no, I cannot. If they discover I am giving milk away, that is considered theft. That is my livelihood. I have a child. I cannot afford to lose this job. You do not understand." "How old is he?" "What?" "Your child. How old?" Sol's eyes softened for a fleeting moment before she regained her composure. "6. Mateo, he is 6. "Then you understand my request better than most." Lorna reached into the pail she had carried up, the one containing yesterday's collection, and withdrew a small, wax-coated parcel. She unwrapped it there in the cold. Inside was a wedge of the fresh cheese, white and pristine, glistening with moisture. She broke off a corner and extended it across the space separating them. "Taste this." "I am not hungry." "It is not about hunger. Taste it." Perhaps it was the cold or the strangeness of the morning, or simply that no one had offered Marisol Reyes anything in a long while without expecting something in return that carried a cost exceeding its value. She accepted the cheese. She placed it in her mouth, and Lorna watched the girl's expression transform. She observed her cease chewing and become still. She watched her look down at the small white piece in her fingers, then up the hill towards the barns, and then back down at it. "What is this?" Saul inquired. It was not truly a question. "That is the milk you poured into my ditch the day before yesterday," Lorna stated. "The salvageable portion. That's what they've been discarding." Saul remained silent. She rotated the cheese in her grasp. "For an extended period each morning, they've been dispatching their errors over my property line," Lorna stated. "And I've permitted it because I was weary and believed there was nothing that could be done. But I've been crafting cheese for 31 years, Saul. And I'm telling you, you can inflict something upon an individual every single day for years and not give it a second thought. Don't be surprised when she eventually discerns you by its aroma." She gathered the vacant buckets and extended them once more. 3 buckets, by the support post. That's all I'm requesting. No one forfeits their employment over 3 buckets of milk that were already headed for waste. Saul contemplated the buckets for a considerable duration. Behind Lorna, the valve had finished its work, and the flow had dwindled to a trickle. Finally, she snatched them and tucked them beneath the truck seat, out of view. "If I am discovered," she declared, "I never encountered you." "You never encountered me," Lorna concurred. Saul climbed back into the driver's seat. Before closing the door, she leaned out, and for the first time, her gaze met Lorna's, rather than sweeping across the surroundings. "That elderly gentleman's canine," she remarked, gesturing towards Bram, who was observing them from his snowy perch. "He excavates the ditch each dawn, precisely where I deposit my waste. I always assumed he was unhinged. He's the sole one among us who has perceived the truth all along." Lorna nodded. For a week, the buckets appeared, and a week was ample time for an action to solidify into a routine. And a routine between 2 cautious individuals marks significant progress towards trust. Lorna began leaving a wrapped portion of cheese tucked inside the empty buckets she returned. And one morning, beneath the elastic band on the gold container, a note appeared, penned in a child's block lettering. "Mateo expresses his gratitude for the cheese." The subsequent morning, Lorna included 2 pieces. Neither woman spoke of it aloud. The fence had developed its own lexicon, imperceptible to the corporation. That same week, Bram revealed the remainder of its message. She was patrolling the boundary with him, as she did each afternoon, when he halted at the low corner where the ditch converged with the property line, refusing to proceed. He positioned himself, his snout low to the fence's base, and emitted a single, sharp, insistent bark, then glanced back at her. Lorna pushed through the desiccated underbrush to investigate his preoccupation. There was a pipe, not the archaic farm drainage tile she was familiar with, the earthenware one her own ancestor had installed. This was newer, constructed of white plastic, 4 inches in diameter, and it extended beneath the fence from the dairy side, terminating in an opening angled downward. Consequently, whatever exited it would flow not along the ditch towards the roadway, where water is destined, but laterally onto her land, in the direction of her well. She traced its path back as far as the fence permitted, crawling on her hands and knees through the snow, and observed its junction with the dairy's primary drain on the opposite side, a contemporary, unblemished fitting, the result of deliberate effort involving a spirit level and a shovel. Someone had meticulously calculated the gradient and positioned that pipe to discharge their refuse onto the lowest, wettest portion of Lorna Keller's property intentionally. For a prolonged period, she remained standing there, the chill seeping through her boots, and surveyed that white conduit. For years, she had operated under the assumption that the ditch was merely runoff, a consequence of indolence, an inconsequential overflow from something too substantial to warrant attention. It was not accidental. It had been deliberately directed. She did not weep. She had maintained her composure at the fence, and she was not about to break now. A firm, unwavering resolve solidified within her, and she declared aloud to the dog, "Very well. Very well, then." She had yet to comprehend why anyone would expend such effort. She discovered the answer 3 days later, when the correspondence arrived. It was printed on substantial paper, bearing a crest at the apex, two verdant hills and a sunrise, accompanied by the word Brightland. It presented itself as an offer to acquire her property, including all water and mineral rights, for the sum of $90,000, a figure described as generous given the parcel's condition and limited agricultural potential. A clause stipulated that the seller would be accountable for any environmental remediation identified post-sale. A contact number and a deadline for the offer's withdrawal were provided. Lorna perused it twice at the kitchen table. $90,000 for the ancestral home, the spring house, the frigid spring her grandmother had referred to as the family's sole true legacy, and for land whose limited agricultural value had been deliberately diminished over years of personal effort. The sheer malevolence of it was so precise, so eloquently articulated, that she almost admired it. The telephone rang that evening. It was Glenn. "They forwarded me a copy," he stated. "Mom, that's a substantial sum. It's more than the property is worth, considering its state. You could relocate down here, secure that sum in the bank, and be settled. I've already investigated. That ground floor unit is still available." "You looked?" Lorna's voice remained even. "Someone needs to consider these matters." "Mom, do you comprehend why that figure exceeds the property's worth? Because they feel remorse about the odor." "I don't know." "Because they require the water," she asserted, "and because someone deliberately installed a pipe beneath my fence to ensure the property's value plummeted to a point where I would ultimately capitulate. They haven't presented me with a magnanimous offer. They've spent years pressuring me towards a lowball bid, and now they've arrived with outstretched hands, smiling." A silence ensued on the line. "Even if that's the case," Glenn finally conceded, his voice softer, "what do you intend to do about it? You're a single individual. They are a corporation with legal representation. You're 68 years old, isolated up there, and you intend to contest a corporation over a malodorous ditch?" "I'm uncertain of my course of action," Lorna replied, "but I will not be signing that today. Mom, good night. Convey my affections to the girl." The individual himself arrived the following week. Lorna was in the spring house when she heard the truck, a pristine dark pickup that had evidently never transported anything more demanding than the man piloting it. She emerged, wiping her hands, to find him standing in the yard, gazing up at the old farmhouse with an unreadable expression. He appeared to be around her age, perhaps slightly younger, of substantial build, clad in a fine coat and clean boots. As he turned and noticed her, his features contorted into an expression of practiced contrition. "Mrs. Keller, I'm uncertain if you recall me. Curtis Decker." She remembered him, Roy's son. A fleeting glint appeared in his eyes at the mention of his father's name. "That's correct. Your father and I processed curd together for 11 years at the old creamery," Lorna recounted. "He was the singular individual I encountered who could ascertain the temperature of a vat with his elbow and be accurate to the degree. He educated half this valley in cheese production." "How is he?" "He's residing in a facility in town now, a reputable one. His faculties fluctuate." Curtis cleared his throat, averted his gaze to his boots, then met her eyes again. "Mrs. Keller, I will be candid. I am here regarding the offer. I understand how this all appears. I acknowledge the pervasive odor has been burdensome, and I apologize for it. I truly do. I would not manage things in this manner if the decision rested with me. But it's a favorable offer, and I came personally because I wished it not to be merely a letter. I wanted you to hear it from someone who knew Hank, someone local." It was a competent performance. He had her late husband's name readily available and his father's regret etched in his eyes. Had Lorna not stood at the fence and peered into the abyss of a white plastic pipe, it might have even swayed her. "You came yourself," she reiterated. "That was considerate of you, Curtis. Allow me to pose a considerate question in return. Whose concept was the pipe?" "The one beneath my fence. New, directed at my well." She observed him closely. "You gauged the slope, or someone in your employ did. You did not discharge waste upon me by chance, young man. You directed it upon me by survey. Mrs. Keller, I don't. There are drainage systems throughout the operation. I cannot account for every conduit. No, she replied not unkindly. You cannot. I grasp that you are not the decision maker. Your father used to make those decisions, and now you labor for individuals in another state who have never experienced the aroma of this valley in their lives, and they instruct you where to aim the pipe, and you comply. She lifted Bram's leash from the porch railing. Your father managed that creamery floor as if it were a sanctuary. He would have abandoned a job rather than contaminate a neighbor's well. You comprehend that more acutely than I do. Curtis's jaw tensed. For a moment, he appeared on the verge of offering a truthful statement. Then he reapplied the practiced expression of regret. You have until the month's end, Mrs. Keller. He entered his pristine truck, but remained seated for a beat longer before starting the engine, his gaze fixed on the springhouse. And then he departed. The following morning, 3 buckets stood behind the leaning post, brimming and immaculate, a dusting of frost shimmering on their surfaces. And there was an additional item, a 4th receptacle, a 5-gallon can which Saul must have brought herself, containing milk richer than the rest, almost golden with cream. A note secured with a rubber band to the handle in a child's meticulous block letters, clearly dictated by an adult. This one is from the old cows. It is the finest. Do not disclose it. Lorna transported the entire collection to the springhouse, 2 buckets at a time. Her breathing labored in the frigid air, and she dedicated the entire day to making cheese. She kept the rich can separate. She warmed it gradually in a copper kettle and worked it with care. And when it set, it solidified more firmly, a golden hue at its core, and the curd emitted a clean squeak against her teeth. She knew, even before pressing a wheel, that this was the milk. This was milk deserving of a building's preservation. This was milk worth a lifetime. Saul arrived on foot after her shift 2 days later, entering from the road and proceeding through the gap in the rear hedge, concealed from the truck's view, with Mateo by the hand, a small, solemn boy in a coat with a broken zipper. Bram, who usually growled at the scent of the ditch and the sound of trucks, walked directly up to the child and sat down, allowing himself to be embraced. I shouldn't be here, Saul stated, observing her son and the dog. But I had to inquire. The gold container, the old cows produced it. Was it any good? Lorna led her into the springhouse and displayed the young wheels resting on the slate. She cut a segment from the experimental corner, and Saul ate it, while standing in the cold stone chamber, the spring murmuring at her feet. Tears welled in her eyes, and she pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth. My grandfather owned cows, she managed to say when she regained her composure. Back home, 2 cows. We made cheese in the kitchen, my entire family in a single room. I haven't tasted anything like this since I was smaller than him. She crouched and drew Mateo close to her side, looking at Lorna over the top of his head. And they are slaughtering them on Friday. Lorna froze. Slaughtering what? The old cows, the brown ones, the ones that yield that... Saul's voice trembled. 31 head, there's a list. Curtis posted it on the board by the time clock. They claim they don't produce enough to justify their upkeep. They're old. They aren't worth the feed. The call truck arrives Friday morning to transport them for beef. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand. That milk in the gold can, by Saturday there will be none of it left. There will never be any again. Lorna didn't respond immediately. She walked to the springhouse door and surveyed the young wheels lined up on Oma's slate, pale and expectant. The gold-hearted ones from the old cows, set apart at the cool end where the spring flowed closest. Friday was 4 days away. She lacked the funds to purchase 31 cows, and she couldn't have articulated, standing there, how a person halts a slaughter truck with a copper kettle and a fence dog. Then we had better not waste any of it, she declared. Saul stared at her. You brought me the finest milk in this valley and a predicament that keeps me awake. That makes it our concern. Lorna picked up a wheel and turned it in her hands. I cannot rescue those cows by Friday with the contents of my coffee can, but I can undertake one action, and I shall commence on Saturday, and you will assist me, and we shall observe the outcome. That Saturday, she journeyed to the market in town for the first time in years. It was a modest affair held in a lot behind the old Grange Hall, featuring a dozen folding tables laden with honey, eggs, and knitted hats, managed by a robust woman named Fay, who had single-handedly organized it since the canning factory's closure. Fay had known Lorna at the creamery. She had even vended its cheddar from her own table at the county fair. When Lorna entered carrying 2 coolers and requesting a corner of someone's table, Fay took one look at her countenance and cleared half her own. "You're back at it," Fay stated. It wasn't a question. "I'm exploring something," Lorna replied. "I don't possess a license yet. I'm aware of that. If it will cause you difficulties, please say so, and I will depart." Fay examined the cheese Lorna was unwrapping, fresh white rounds in the initial small wheels, firm enough to slice, and folded her arms. "Let me tell you what causes me difficulties. Witnessing this entire valley being acquired and dismantled while everyone maintains a low profile. Display it. If anyone inquires, you're offering samples. Samples are complimentary. The basket at the end is for contributions." A faint smile touched her lips. People donate generously when they appreciate something. They were sold out, every last morsel, in under an hour. It commenced with the regulars, the women who recollected the creamery. They tasted a sample, fell silent, and then purchased 2 of whatever Lorna permitted them to have. One elderly gentleman held a sliver on his tongue, his eyes closed, and remarked, "That's the washed rind. That's the original recipe." Lorna confirmed it was related, and he procured 4 rounds, shaking her hand with both of his. Word spread across the lot with the speed characteristic of small communities. A gentleman tasted the gold-hearted wheel and returned 3 times. By 10 o'clock, a queue had formed at Fay's table, and nothing remained for sale. A younger fellow in a canvas apron and stylish glasses, a chef who journeyed from the city every few weeks for local produce, stood there turning the final empty wrapper in his hands and inquiring about its maker. "She did," Fay indicated, pointing. The chef looked at Lorna with the surprise of someone encountering a name they had heard without knowing its source. "This fresh round, what is it, a day old? 2? I've tasted cheese in France that wasn't this exquisite." He placed a card on the table. "Whatever you can produce, I will acquire. A standing order. And if you ever age that gold one into a mature wheel, contact me before anyone else." "I genuinely mean that." Lorna placed $9 from the chef's card into her coat pocket and considerably more than $9 into the donation basket at the end. She drove home with empty coolers, her hands steady on the steering wheel, and a lightness in her chest she hadn't experienced since the make-room door had clicked shut for the final time. They had been discarding their errors over her fence for years, and she was the first to bother inquiring about the potential of a mistake. Now, the entire town was eager to know as well. If you've reached this point in Lorna's narrative, please subscribe, because what these 2 women decided to do next is the part I've been anticipating sharing. Because the market revenue, even with Fay's discreet contribution from the donation basket, and a $100 bill that a soul refused to reclaim, amounted to a little under $4,000. Lorna's personal savings, the contents of the coffee can, the passbook account, and the funds set aside for burials totaled a sum slightly less than $15,500, calculating at $500 per head for the 31 cull cows. She was $4,000 short with only 3 days to procure it, and she had already resolved to find it, which represents a significant portion of its actual acquisition. She discovered that the chef's standing order could secure an advance. Fay knew a retired agricultural agent who was privy to the cull buyers' prices down to the cent, and a shared problem in a valley that had been experiencing decline for years, it turned out, was not as isolating a burden as one might anticipate. By Wednesday evening, Lorna had the money counted out in an envelope on her kitchen table, and on Thursday morning, she drove up the access lane she had so often listened to in the darkness, parked in front of the dairy office, and requested Curtis Decker. He emerged into the chill, holding a clipboard and bearing the look of a man who already foresaw an argument he hadn't yet heard. "Mrs. Keller, those 31 cows are destined for slaughter tomorrow at $500 per head," Lorna stated. I will pay you the same amount today in cash, and you will load them onto my trailer instead of the butcher's. Your company's financial outcome remains unchanged. Someone still receives 31 cows from your barn and a check in your hand. The sole distinction is that mine will breathe on the other end of the transaction. Curtis glanced at the envelope. He looked at the elderly woman holding it. He gazed for a considerable moment towards the barns where the brown cows stood, the last remnants of the valley's small farms herds. Cows his own father had likely traded with men who were now deceased. "It's not my decision," he said, but his conviction had waned. "It is precisely your decision," Lorna countered. "You direct the pipe, you post the list, you can load a trailer." She placed the envelope on the hood of his clean truck. $15,500. Count it. The trailer will arrive at 6 o'clock in the morning. I would consider it a kindness if you were the one to bring them down. He did not verbally agree, but he did not return the envelope, and as she drove away, he remained standing there, envelope in hand, gazing at the barns. What Lorna did not realize, as she drove home, her hands trembling now that no one could witness them, was that two other developments were already in motion towards her. The first was a formal complaint. Someone had contacted the state dairy board to report an unlicensed cheese operation being conducted from a stone shed on the old Keller property, selling to the public without inspection, posing a danger to consumers. The board was unaware at that moment that it was a corporation that had initiated the complaint. It merely understood that action was required, and a notice had already been typed and was enclosed in its own envelope. The second was a strategic plan bearing a name. Lorna's parcel was situated at the lowest point of the dairy's land, the natural location for the waste facility that every operation of that magnitude requires. The company had devised an expansion plan, and the focal point of this expansion was a manure lagoon spanning 8 acres, and the engineers had designated the optimal site directly above a cold, clean spring that would facilitate excavation and provide a convenient water table. They had been attempting to pressure the elderly woman out for years. Now they had a deadline by which they needed her gone, and an elderly woman purchasing their cull cows was not a scenario they had anticipated. But that was a concern for the following day. Friday morning at 6 o'clock, in the stark pink light of dawn, Curtis Decker personally escorted 31 brown cows down the access lane, leading them slowly. He held a halter on the lead cow and guided her on foot through the cold, and the rest followed her, as old cows will follow the one they trust. He spoke little when he handed Lorna the rope. Lorna, Saul, and a borrowed stock trailer, along with a neighbor providing a second trailer, transported them. The cows emerged stiffly and slowly, aged females with large, gentle eyes and hips sturdy enough to support a hat. And Bram moved among their massive, unhurried legs, low and assured, proud to once again have livestock to manage. Mateo sat on the fence and counted them aloud as they passed, all the way to 31. Curtis stood at the gate as the last one moved through. He did not look at the cows. He looked at the spring house. "My father worked with wheels in there as a boy," he said. "Before it belonged to your family, it served the entire valley. Everyone brought milk down to that spring." He shook his head once. "I posted that cull list myself. 31 cows my own father likely milked. I genuinely don't know what I'm doing anymore, Mrs. Keller. I truly don't." "You just performed one right action," Lorna stated. "Attempt another tomorrow. They accumulate." He almost smiled. Then he entered his truck and drove back to the individuals who employed him. The cows represented the commencement of the labor, not its conclusion. 31 milking cows require milking twice daily, every day, indefinitely. The sustenance of the farm required more than just provision, it demanded shelter. Lorna, already possessing a chicken coop and a spring house, found herself with 68 years etched onto her being. Then the valley responded. It answered because one determined endeavor had finally demonstrated its feasibility. On the second day, a young couple arrived. They were the husband and wife who, a year prior, had witnessed their own livestock fall prey to the same corporation. Subsequently toiling in town, their spirits thoroughly dampened. They stood on the grounds, and the wife voiced their plea. "We understood you were seeking assistance with your cattle. We require no remuneration. Our sole desire is to be near cows once more. The husband, a man who had seemingly held his breath for a year, offered a silent assent. A former operator of the old creamery's boiler appeared, his toolkit in hand, and restored the springhouse plumbing to operational status. Two women from the local market began their Saturday routines, assisting with wrapping and labeling. Meanwhile, Saul made the pivotal decision to leave the dairy. It wasn't so much a resignation as a conscious choice not to return. The morning after her conversation with Mateo, she arrived with a single garbage bag containing her belongings. Standing in the yard, she declared, "They will dismiss me regardless, once they grasp the intricacies of the milk. I would prefer you be the one to dismiss me. Instruct me. I wish to acquire the proper knowledge." And so Lorna became her mentor. Amidst the rising steam from the copper kettle, her forearms submerged in the curd beside the younger women, she taught Saul to discern the precise moment the milk transformed, to interpret the subtle squeak, and to recognize by the ambient scent of the room when a product was ready for the next stage or when it required an additional hour. She guided her on how to divide the curd with gentle strokes to prevent bruising, how to perceive its progression, and how a formed wheel communicates its readiness to leave the press through its own inherent weight. Saul retained every detail of Lorna's instruction: the warmth of the curd, the nourishing grasses the cows consumed, the purity of the spring water, and the diligent hands that shaped it. A label can be falsified, Lorna impressed upon her, but genuine craftsmanship cannot. Mateo, even before mastering his multiplication tables, learned the art of salting a cheese rind. He would perch on a milk crate at the table, his tongue protruding in concentration, meticulously rubbing brine into a wheel with the gravity of a surgeon. A harmonious cadence emerged amongst them before any of them could articulate it. 4 individuals, most mornings, commenced their labor in the pre-dawn chill at 4 o'clock, the cows exhaling mist in the lean-to while the kettle similarly steamed in the springhouse. Mateo slumbering on a cot near the wood stove, and Bram a quiet presence on the floor beside him. Lorna had long harbored the conviction that family was an entity one was born into and could consequently lose. It transpired, however, that family comprised those who willingly appeared to tend to the wheels at 4 in the morning. The official notification from the state arrived on a Tuesday. Its tone was courteous yet unequivocal. The operation was deemed unlicensed, and all cheese sales and distribution were to cease immediately, pending an inspection and licensing of a facility that adhered to regulations, a process the letter plainly indicated could extend for months and require financial resources beyond her immediate reach. It included a clause regarding penalties and a specific stipulation that raw milk cheese in particular could not be sold under any circumstances unless aged for a minimum of 60 days, a condition her fresh rounds, her staple product in standing order, did not meet. Lorna perused the document at the kitchen table, Saul intently observing from over her shoulder, and she understood instantly that the timing of this directive was no coincidence. Someone had deployed the sole instrument capable of ceasing her activities without the direct intervention of a trucker or inspector. Curtis? Saul inquired softly. Curtis, who had once expertly facilitated their pipework, offered his assessment. I doubt he initiated this decree. Lorna refolded the letter, acknowledging that while Curtis might not have made the call, someone who held sway over Curtis had. That afternoon, she drove to his residence in town, requesting an audience with Roy Decker. A nurse escorted her down a broad, sunlit corridor to a man she had not encountered in 2 decades. His form diminished in a chair by a window, a blanket draped over his knees. His eyes, initially clouded and distant, cleared as she approached and announced, "Roy, it's Lorna, from the make room." A flicker of recognition surfaced from the haze. Lorna. His hand, dry and delicate as a bird's wing, sought hers. We had a productive vat going. Did we complete it? We did, Roy. It was a magnificent batch. She held his hand, then ventured, Roy, I need to ask you something, and I'm uncertain how much you will retain. Your son, Curtis, Is he a decent man beneath all of it? The old man's eyes welled up, and for a fleeting moment, their clarity was absolute. I imparted the knowledge of the milk to him, Roy stated, and subsequently I taught him its commerce. May God forgive me, I taught him to sell all of it. His grip tightened. Inform him. Tell him the spring does not belong to those who wield wealth. Tell him I conveyed this. I shall tell him, Roy. He was a good lad at the spring, the old man murmured, his gaze drifting once more towards the window, his eyes returning to the outside world. Lorna commenced her drive home in the darkness, the old man's words a heavy burden in her chest. She found Saul waiting in the yard, his face ashen, holding the telephone. It was Curtis, Saul reported. He contacted the house. He mentioned they've expedited the lagoon project. He said the surveying team is arriving Friday, and a hauler is scheduled for the same morning to retrieve the cattle, to repossess them. They're claiming the sale was unauthorized, and the check is invalid. Her voice faltered. Friday. Both the cattle and the spring and the entire shutdown, all converging on Friday morning. Lorna found no solace in sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table, the state's decree and the offer letter laid out side by side, the lamp casting its glow. Sometime past midnight, her gaze shifted from the documents to the resources at her disposal that the corporation had overlooked. There was a pipe, concealed beneath her fence, for which no permit in existence could account. There was a young woman who had meticulously photographed 3 months of their disposal logs on her phone before leaving the job. There was a well situated 60 feet from a discharge point, in a state that imposed penalties on operations for a mere tenth of what had been systematically poured onto her land. The corporation possessed the legal counsel. Lorna possessed the unvarnished truth, captured in photographs and dated records, and knowledge of a manure lagoon they intended to excavate directly over a spring they had deliberately contaminated for years, complete with a paper trail to corroborate their awareness of its presence. She had no intention of initiating legal action. She lacked both the years and the financial means for such a pursuit, and retribution had never yielded a single wheel of cheese. What she held was leverage, a door she could open and a door she could firmly close. By 4 o'clock in the morning, she had formulated her strategy. By 5, the team had assembled in her kitchen. Saul, Faye, the young couple, and the boiler man, all sipping coffee in a hushed camaraderie. You are not obligated to be present when they arrive, Lorna informed them. This has the potential to become contentious, and none of you committed to dealing with unpleasantness. Faye set down her cup. I have observed this company systematically dismantle this valley, farm by farm, for 10 years, and I have never once had the opportunity to stand defiant. I am not departing. No one else moved towards the door either. At 6 o'clock, the vehicles descended the access lane. There were 3 in total: a pickup truck bearing the company insignia, a flatbed laden with survey stakes, and a transit, followed by a lumbering, heavy cattle hauler, its empty sides rattling. They maneuvered into the yard, and a man emerged from the lead truck. He was younger, attired in a pristine barn coat that had never encountered actual barn work, clutching a clipboard with the casual assurance of someone who had personally lost nothing. Mrs. Keller, he addressed her, I believe you have been afforded ample notification. The surveying crew will commence staking the parcel this morning, and the hauler is here for 31 head that were released to you without authorization. We can proceed amicably. You could begin by removing your truck from my grandmother's lawn, Lorna retorted, and then we can discuss amicability. He offered an indulgent smile, the kind reserved for those who had heard elderly women refuse before. There is no discussion to be had. The sale was rescinded. The cattle are company property, and the cessation order concerning your small cheese enterprise originated from the state, not from us. Therefore, do not cast me in the role of the antagonist. He turned a page. You possess water rights that are under contract with us, and a parcel designated for purchase. You should have finalized the agreement in the fall. Now it has become a matter of condemnation. It is a discharge matter, Lorna stated. That was the initial instance his pen ceased its movement. You buried a pipe beneath my fence, Lorna continued, her tone even and unhurried. a 4-inch conduit angled precisely towards my well. For years, you have been running unpermitted dairy waste onto my land and into my groundwater every single morning. We have the dates. We have photographic evidence of your own disposal logs. And the spring over which you intend to excavate your 8-acre lagoon is the very same spring towards which your discharge has been flowing. This means that on the day you break ground, you will be constructing a manure pit atop a contamination site that you yourself created and documented. She allowed the weight of her words to settle. I am not an attorney, she conceded, but I spent a lifetime adjacent to men who incurred substantial fines for the spillage of a single tank. And I am acutely aware of the state's procedures when an operation deliberately poisons a neighbor's well, and then attempts to acquire that very well. Therefore, here is the straightforward approach. You will take your trucks and depart, leaving the cattle and the spring behind, and you will remove the pipe. And what I hold within this folder will remain confidential. The man's smile had vanished entirely. You are bluffing. You possess nothing. And even if you did, you are merely one elderly woman. Do you truly wish to expend the remainder of your life contesting us in court? At 68, Lorna declared, I have an abundance of time and a clear conscience. You are the one operating under a strict timetable. She is not bluffing, Curtis Decker announced. No one had heard his truck arrive. He had parked it on the roadside and walked in, approaching across the yard now, a folder of his own tucked under his arm. He did not pause at the company's designated boundary. He approached and stood beside Lorna, beside the elderly woman and her dog, and the individuals from the market, placing his folder onto the hood of the company truck. Curtis, the younger man admonished, exercise caution. Go home. This is not your concern. It is precisely my concern. Curtis opened his folder. The survey map, marked within our own office, clearly indicating the pipe relocation and the well situated 60 feet away. The work order for the relocation duly signed. 3 years of disposal logs for the northern tank, and the engineering memorandum concerning the lagoon site, which states, and I quote, that the existing seepage from the boundary discharge will reduce permitting scrutiny on the spring. He then addressed the company representative. I made several calls this morning. The state water office, the county, and a reporter that the sheriff in the city provided me with, who has been investigating Valley Dairies for a year. I entrusted all of it to them. It has already been disseminated. There is no longer a folder to conceal. The young man stared at him, incredulous. You have just ended your career. I spent 30 years determining what constituted waste, Curtis stated, what was worth preserving and what was discarded. Cattle, farms, her well, my father's name on a building I sold. He shook his head slowly. The last thing I nearly discarded was myself. I am finished. My father dedicated his entire life to that creamery, and I transformed it into a facility that directs pipes at elderly women. I would rather face destitution than continue as that for a single day longer. For a moment, an arresting silence fell. The survey crew remained by their flatbed, their equipment untouched. The hauler driver had not even lowered the ramp. Into this profound quiet, another vehicle approached down the lane, this time a sedan with city plates. Glenn Keller alighted, his gaze sweeping over the trucks, the gathering crowd, and his mother standing by the gate. The color drained from his face. Ma, he exclaimed, his voice strained. They contacted me. They informed me you were scheduled for removal this morning and that I needed to arrive here immediately to prevent you from taking an action you would regret. He paused, his eyes falling upon the 31 brown cows in the lean-to, the cheese coolers on the porch, the assembled individuals beside his mother, and the company representative holding a clipboard that now seemed utterly devoid of significance. What is all of this? What have you done here? I have been making cheese, Glenn, Lorna replied calmly. Either stand with me or go home, but make your decision promptly. I am in the midst of something. Glenn Keller regarded his mother for a considerable duration. Then he strode over and positioned himself on her side of the divide, placing a hand on her shoulder. Turning to the company representative and embodying the resolve of his mother's son, he stated, I am in the business of selling insurance. Would you care to discuss your liability exposure regarding a documented, intentional groundwater discharge? Because I would be more than willing to engage in that discussion all morning. Commence with how your carrier reacts when they discover you concealed such information. The company representative rapidly assessed the situation. The calculation was swift, a bluff he could have easily overcome. An elderly woman acting alone, he could have outlasted. However, a documented discharge, a disaffected manager, a journalist, a son who understood the term liability, and a yard full of witnesses. On the very morning they intended to excavate a manure lagoon over a poisoned spring was not a battle worth the cost of the spring itself. He closed his clipboard. "I will need to present this to the company," he announced. "By all means," Lorna replied. They departed as they had arrived, 3 trucks executing a turn in her yard and grinding their way back up the access lane, the empty cattle haulers rattling most pronounced. The assembled crews stood in the biting cold, watching them depart, and no one offered a cheer, for it did not feel like an occasion for celebration. It felt like the precise moment a protracted fever finally breaks, when one is too exhausted for anything but the simple act of breathing. The corporation reclaimed its claim, and faced with the stark arithmetic, acted as corporations often do when their inexpensive cruelty ceases to be affordable. They withdrew. Within the month, the expansion project was discreetly relocated. The lagoon plans redrawn for a site 3 farms over. The purchase offer was rescinded with a letter so frigid it nearly elicited a laugh from Lorna. A representative from the state arrived, examined the pipe, took his own photographs, and compelled the company to remove it, imposing a fine that held little financial consequence for them, yet was significant in principle. On a Tuesday, they unearthed the pipe, and Lorna walked down to observe its long, white length being hoisted from the ground, dripping with filth. She remained silent, simply watching. The dumping ceased. After countless mornings, one overcast afternoon, she stood at her fence and listened. There was no truck in the pre-dawn darkness, and there never would be again. The reporter's story was published that spring, spanning 2 full pages, accompanied by a photograph of the extracted pipe lying in the parched grass. Residents of the valley, who had for a long time kept their heads down, read it at their kitchen tables and felt a sentiment they had not experienced in years. The realization that the small could indeed compel the large to account for itself. The state initiated an official inquiry into the entire operation. While none of this directly facilitated the return of the 40 farms, nor was it entirely Lorna's doing, it served as a potent warning to the corporation that the valley was now vigilant, and a watched company operated with greater caution and deliberation. Curtis, as the young man had foretold, lost his position. He sat in his truck outside the dairy office one final time, a box of his belongings on the seat, and then drove down the valley to the only place that still seemed to welcome him. "I have no fixed destination," he told Lorna, standing in her yard with his hands in his pockets, 55 years old, unemployed, and lighter than she had ever seen him. "I understand the milk. I understand the ledgers, and I am familiar with every regulation the company taught me to circumvent, which means I know how to do it correctly. If you will accept me, I will muck out the stalls. I am unconcerned about the task." Lorna observed him for a moment, then said, "Your father sent you a message. He said the spring does not belong to the men of means. He asked me to relay that to you. And he said you were a good boy at the spring." Curtis Decker turned his face away, his shoulders shaking once. When he turned back, his eyes were moist and clear. "Where would you like me to begin?" 4 o'clock in the morning, Lorna replied, "the same as everyone else." A considerable amount of work remained, much of it far removed from a confrontation in a frozen yard. The advance from the chefs, the market funds, and a modest loan Fay secured from a farm cooperative initiative were channeled into the construction of a proper make-room, an addition to the old spring house, fabricated from stainless steel, inspected and finally licensed. Curtis, having spent so long mastering the art of evading dairy regulations, proved remarkably adept at applying them correctly, thus ensuring their facility passed inspection on the first attempt. The fresh rounds, gently pasteurized for the market, and the standing order were now legal, vibrant and equally cherished, alongside the raw milk from the gold-hearted cows, the true treasure, destined for its intended recipients. On the day the license finally arrived in the mail, Curtis himself affixed it to the make-room wall with 4 precisely placed tacks, stepping back to gaze at it for an extended period, with Lorna granting him the space. For a man who had spent his entire existence on the wrong side of a rule, finding himself at last on the right side offered a profound and quiet sense of solace. On a morning in early spring, with the make-room complete and the license elegantly framed on the wall, the entire crew gathered amidst the rising steam. Lorna commenced the first true batch of the wheel she had envisioned since that frigid January morning kneeling in the ditch. She worked the curd with deliberate slowness. She pressed the wheels with significant weight. The rinds she meticulously rubbed with brine and salt, then placed them on Oma's slate shelves in the cool extremity of the spring house, where the spring maintained a constant temperature of 52 degrees Fahrenheit, allowing them to mature, transform, and improve for nearly a year. "What shall we name it?" Saul inquired, her hands dusted with salt, Mateo asleep once more on the cot, and Bram a content, gray presence on the floor. Lorna ran her palm over the first wheel, cool and firm, imbued with everything Valley had attempted to discard. The entire crew had fallen silent, awaiting her pronouncement. The boilerman, the young couple, and Curtis, his sleeves rolled up and his forearms reddened from the brine, all looked towards the elderly woman standing before the wheel. "My grandmother crafted cheese in this very room before any of us were born," she stated. "We referred to her as Oma. It is simply the archaic term for grandmother." She surveyed the long row of pale wheels settling into their slumber on the slate. "We shall call it Oma's Reserve, and in 10 months we shall discover its true character." Saul smiled. "And then?" "And then," Lorna declared, "I believe we shall submit one of these to the nation's most prestigious cheese competition, allowing a panel of judges who have never experienced the aroma of this valley to articulate to the world what we already intimately know." She wiped her hands on her apron and extinguished the make-room light. The wheels rested on the slate in the cool darkness, commencing their slow, deliberate journey towards their inherent destiny. The wheels slumbered on the slate through spring and into summer, while the work continued around them. Twice daily, the cows were milked. Each morning, the make-room bustled with steam. Lorna personally turned the aging wheels, a task she performed every few days, her palm caressing their rinds, sensing the subtle miracle unfolding beneath the surface. She entrusted this crucial turning only to herself, desiring her hands to be intimately connected with each wheel as they developed their unique character. By late summer, the springhouse housed over 200 wheels of Oma's Reserve, representing various stages of maturation. The fresh cheese had found its way into 3 city restaurants and a cooperative grocery store 2 counties away. Curtis managed the books and oversaw the milking, proving to be, much like his father, a man who could intuitively assess a vat by the feel of its contents. Saul now crafted cheese alongside Lorna as an equal partner, her name appearing on the license beneath Lorna's own: Marisol Reyes, cheesemaker. Mateo, at a mere 6.5 years old, could distinguish good curd from bad and proudly announced his findings to anyone who would listen. The 31 original cows had by then produced a litter of calves, their large brown eyes mirroring their mothers. The herd, once slated for slaughter by the company, was now flourishing. They would live out their days grazing in the lush grass by the fence, a small measure of justice in Lorna's estimation. Bram, now nearly fully gray, spent most of his days dozing by the make-room door. Yet he still patrolled the fence at dawn, habitually pausing at the low corner, finding nothing there but grass, as the ditch had long since healed. This was invariably the first detail visitors who had previously known the place would notice. The discarded conduit was gone, exhumed and transported away by the very governmental body that had previously neglected her concerns. The withered earth bordering the boundary had been revitalized into lush greenery by a single wet spring, and the grass had returned with a vigorous density. By the month of July, the aged bovines were grazing right up to the perimeter where for years nothing had managed to flourish. The natural spring flowed with crystalline clarity. Lorna now had its contents analyzed twice annually, and on both occasions, the results consistently confirmed its purity, coolness, and excellent quality. 52 degrees Fahrenheit. This was her grandmother's sole genuine legacy, continuing its flow. On the day the notification arrived concerning the cheese competition, it was 4 in the morning, and they were all gathered in the production room. Faye took the call as the office telephone was closest to her. She stood with the receiver pressed to her ear, her free hand splayed flat against the stainless steel table, remaining utterly silent for an extended period. Then she finally spoke. "I will inform her." She terminated the call, turned around, her eyes brimming. "Lorna," she declared, "Oma's Reserve, selected from over 1,000 cheeses, has been awarded Best in Show." There was no boisterous cheering. That was the peculiar and wonderful aspect of that particular morning. Lorna pondered this development at length afterward. Certain individuals might have anticipated a scene of jubilant celebration filling the kitchen. Instead, the room fell into a quiet reverence. Saul brought his floral-patterned hand to cover his mouth. Curtis slowly lowered himself onto an overturned wooden crate. And Mateo, though not fully comprehending the magnitude of the event, recognized its significance and rushed to embrace the dog. Lorna herself simply remained standing, her forearms submerged in a vat of warm curd that could not be abandoned, engaged in the necessary work regardless of accolades received. She felt a stinging sensation in her eyes and continued to stir. "Best in Show," she whispered to the curd, more to the dairy product itself than to anyone else present. "Did you hear that, Oma?" By midday, the office telephone was ringing incessantly. Faye ultimately removed it from its cradle to enable them to complete the afternoon milking. The culinary artist called twice. A specialty cheese establishment in the city made contact. A woman from 3 states away called solely to convey that she had wept in her automobile upon hearing the news, as her own grandmother had once crafted a similar cheese, and she had believed such a creation was lost to the world. Lorna addressed that particular call herself. She assured the woman that it was not lost. It had merely been awaiting its moment, and a portion would be available for purchase come autumn. The acknowledgement changed everything, and it did so with remarkable speed. The city chef communicated the news to a food journalist, who in turn disseminated it across the nation. Within a month, Springhouse Creamery was inundated with orders that they could not possibly fulfill, originating from establishments in cities Lorna had never visited, from individuals willing to expend $40 for a segment of cheese produced from milk that a corporation had discarded as waste. One man contacted her and proposed to purchase the entire enterprise, the name, the recipe, and the spring itself, offering a sum with an impressive number of zeros. Lorna declined his offer before he had even finished stating it. "They persist in referring to it as an empire," she confided to Faye one evening. They were seated on the porch, the valley below them bathed in the deepening blue of twilight. The writer employed that term, the cheese empire. I find it rather disagreeable. Why is that? You have established something significant. Take pride in it. I am proud. I am more proud than I can adequately express. Lorna rocked gently for a while. But an empire is something one constructs through acquisition. We, however, built this from what was cast aside. That is the antithesis of an empire. It is simply bending down and retrieving what no one else desired. She observed a barn light illuminate across the valley. Prosperity was never meant to be something one locks away in a vault, Faye. It is what you set free so it can nourish someone down the path. That is all this has ever been. We merely liberated the waste. Consequently, instead of merely selling, Lorna nurtured its growth in the only manner that resonated with her. Scattered throughout the valley were small-scale farms barely clinging to existence. These were the last holdouts, not yet absorbed by the large dairy conglomerates. Families were milking 40 and 50 cows, receiving diminishing payments each year. Lorna and Faye initiated a cooperative venture, a genuine one. the kind the valley had once possessed before the creamery ceased operations. Springhouse Creamery would purchase their milk, all of it, at a remunerative price, exceeding fair market value, and transform it into cheese that would bear the valley's name nationwide. One by one, the remaining farms joined the cooperative. One by one, their lights remained illuminated through the winter. An elderly dairy farmer, who had already engaged an auctioneer, drove to sign the agreements. Upon completion, he sat in Lorna's kitchen, turning his cap in his hands, and remarked, "I was scheduled to sell everything this Thursday. 40 years of work, and I was prepared to let it all go for a pittance." He looked at her, his eyes moist. "You have restored my livelihood." Lorna informed him that he had provided her with his milk, and thus they were even, and poured him more coffee. A family who had already divested themselves of their herd and were in the process of relocating, heard of the initiative, unpacked their belongings, reacquired livestock, and remained. Within 2 years, the cooperative was acquiring milk from 9 valley farms. The name of the valley, which had previously been a name of little interest to outsiders, began appearing on cheese displays in cities 1,000 miles distant. Individuals who had never set foot in the region consumed their product at their tables, unknowingly tasting a frigid spring, the stubborn resolve of an elderly woman, and a herd of 31 cows that were presumed to be deceased by that time. That was the aspect Lorna cherished most, surpassing even the recognition of the award and the influx of orders. One October day, a young couple ascended the lane. The husband was unemployed, and the wife was pregnant. Their dairy had been lost to the same corporation that had contaminated Lorna's fence line, and they stood in her yard, unsure how to articulate their need. Lorna recognized the expression. She had worn it herself at a fence at dawn. "Do you understand cattle?" she inquired. "Our entire lives," the husband replied. "It is all we know. That is the predicament." "It is not a predicament here," Lorna stated. "It is the entire purpose. Come inside out of the cold. We commence at 4 in the morning. I will provide you with advance notice, and the dog manages the gate, not you. He will alert you if you forget." She placed coffee in their hands and followed it with a question. It was the same inquiry Oma used to pose to anyone who visited the spring seeking sustenance, not whether they could afford it, but whether they were capable of working. And they were indeed able to work, and thus they also remained. By springtime, the wife had given birth, and a bassinet occupied the space in the production room office, next to Mateo's former cot. The husband, having secured the dawn milking duties, sang softly to the cows, experiencing a happiness that surpassed his ability to articulate. By the second summer, they had inaugurated a modest establishment in the old grain shed by the roadside. It was unpretentious, featuring a refrigerator, a counter, and a window designed to offer a view into the production room. On Saturdays, the gravel parking area filled with vehicles from throughout the valley and from neighboring cities. People who had read about the cheese and desired to visit the place of its creation. Saul managed the counter and could expertly guide a newcomer through the origin of each wheel of cheese, specifying the farm from which the milk was sourced, the particular week of production, and the prevailing grass conditions that month. Children pressed their faces against the window, observing the curd rise from the whey. On some mornings, Lorna would gaze out at that crowded lot, at the road that for years had attracted no slowing vehicles due to the prevailing odor, shake her head, and return to her work with the cheese wheels. By then, Saul had developed her own cheese. She had taken fresh curd and pressed it into a small, aged round infused with herbs. The recipe was one her own grandmother had created in a faraway kitchen, with only 2 cows in the yard. The city chef featured it on his menu under her name. The first time Saul saw her name inscribed there, Marisol's Tom, she walked out to the truck and sat alone for a period. Upon her return, her eyes were red, and she offered no explanation. Lorna did not inquire, understanding that certain achievements are earned and cherished in solitude. Every Friday, a tray of the freshly made rounds was delivered to the local food pantry. These were the wheels that emerged slightly imperfect for sale, but possessed the same excellent flavor. Lorna refused to entertain any notion of it being charity. "It is milk that would have been discarded," she contended. "Now it nourishes a child. That is simply basic calculation." The individual to whom you extend a helping hand, Lorna had learned throughout her long life, often possesses a way of reaching back and lifting you higher than you ever lifted them. She had reached down for 31 cows that no one wanted, and a young woman discarding milk in the darkness. And in return, they had given her a creamery, a family, and a compelling reason to rise before the sun, entirely independent of sorrow. That autumn, Curtis brought a portion of Oma's reserve to his father. He cut it into small, tender pieces as the old man's teeth were failing. He placed it on Roy's tongue himself, and Roy Decker, emerging from a profound mental fog, experienced a moment of complete lucidity, tasted it, and began to weep. "That is the valley," Roy articulated. "The entire valley resides within that." "Who made this?" Curtis replied, standing at the spring. "I did, Pop." "I have returned to the spring." Roy clasped his son's hand and did not release it. He passed away peacefully 3 weeks later in his sleep, the taste of the valley still lingering within him. Curtis stood at the front of the church and stated that his father had imparted the milk's essence to him twice in his life, once as a boy and again when he was an elderly man, too disoriented to realize he was still imparting wisdom. He added that the latter lesson was the one that truly resonated. Glenn began visiting most weekends. He brought his daughter, and the young girl took a liking to the production room. Lorna found herself standing behind her granddaughter, her hands guiding the child's small hands as they performed the figure-8 motion in the warm curd, a technique her own grandmother had taught her. The lineage continued through the cool stone room and the years, unbroken after all. "Like this, Grandma?" the girl would ask. "Just like that," Lorna would reply, slowly. "The curd is not going anywhere." The small hands would steady beneath hers. "I'm sorry, Mom," Glenn expressed to her one late evening, the two of them drying wheels in the lamplight. "I wanted to move you into that care facility. I thought I was saving you. I didn't realize you were already saving everyone up here." "You arrived when it mattered," Lorna responded. "You stood on the correct side of the boundary. That is all one can ask of their child." She handed him a cloth. "Stop apologizing and turn that wheel. The wheels are indifferent to your regrets." On a frigid, clear morning the following January, a full year having passed since the dawn she had knelt in the ditch, Lorna walked the fence line with Bram, as was her custom. The dog, now aged and moving slower than her, stopped at the low corner and lowered his old nose to the spot where the pipe had once been. There was only frost, grass, and the faint exhalation of the cows steaming in the distance. The spring flowed clear and cold beneath its thin layer of ice. Somewhere far up the hill, the large dairy operation was already milking 2,000 head, and it would continue its operations. That was not Lorna's responsibility to rectify. Her corner of the valley comprised a stone spring house, 31 aging cows, and the subsequent calves they had produced, a production room that held the aroma of warm milk before sunrise, and a fence that no longer delineated the boundary between someone's refuse and someone's home. She crouched beside the dog, her own knees now yielding, and placed her bare hand flat on the frozen grass that had re-emerged from what seemed like death. She contemplated the morning she had scooped a handful of clabbered milk from the dirt, lifted it to her face, and understood, even before her mind fully grasped it, that all those years of cruelty had failed to destroy it. Her grandmother had been correct, standing in that very same doorway 60 years prior. Milk does not spoil, it transforms. And the sole distinction between something that is wasted and something that sustains you lies in whether someone who possesses the knowledge of its use ever takes the initiative to kneel and observe. "Come on, old man," Lorna said to the dog, rising to her feet. She and the dog walked back toward the spring house, where lamps were illuminated, the kettle was steaming, and the individuals who had become her family were already engaged in the morning's cheese production. Nothing in that valley had ever truly been waste. It had merely been awaiting someone who knew what to do with it. And the scent that wafted down the hill to meet her now in the cold, clean air was that of her grandmother's kitchen. Every Saturday morning of her youth, and an entire valley that had finally, after all that time, come home.